the few seats, the none left, we are sold out, the 150 seats are gone. The event was sponsored by Canterbury Christchurch, and we want to thank them for their support. And lots of people have been working behind the scenes, and there'll be lots of thank yous at the end of this day, acknowledging all that support. But the conference is the product of the energy and hard work of the organising team. And I want to especially thank at this juncture Ellie Lee, Claire Murphy, Catherine O'Brien and Rebecca Schiller for their ideas, their enthusiasm, their expertise and their commitment to this event. But I also want to make particular special thanks, and she'll be embarrassed at this point, but to Jennie Bristow, who has championed the conference from its conception. She's seen it through gestation. She's been organised today with its delivery, and she's even organised all our feeding needs. Without Jenny's baby. So I have to do the usual stuff about health and safety. We're not expecting any fire alarms to go off. If they do, it's real. So just exit via the doors when there's green signs. Every door actually, so everybody might grab a door and leave, and just muster in the car park at front. The only other thing I want to say before we hand over to the first panel is to introduce you to Marcus Roberts, who is our faculty web editor, and who is he's much better than Jenny and I at anything to do with social media. So he's going to explain about super media war. Please do. Thank you very much.
Good morning everyone, and a big welcome to everyone who's come to us today. My name is Marcus Roberts, I'm the faculty web editor for Social and Applied Sciences. I just really want to just make you aware of a hashtag we're using today called Policing Pregnancy. I really want to encourage anyone with using Twitter or Instagram to really engage using the hashtag, just to really share your experience today. A hashtag is a great way of actually sharing or mentioning a topic that many people might be discussing, and it's a great way of actually creating a social buzz of actually where a group of people can actually explain about something that they may be debating or sharing. I'm going to show you what it means, and also just explain about what things you might want to share today, and just get you thinking about what you might want to do. So just going to quickly show the screen. So we've created a social media wall, and I just want to say thank you to people really who contributed today. There's some wonderful conversations that are already happening. Again, with the policing pregnancy, if you just use the hashtag at the top, make sure there's no space between, because it'd be a shame if we don't get that conversation. One of the things you might want to use this hashtag for, if you've been sort of a speaker that you really like what they've said, or actually you may have a question, the hashtag would be a great way of actually asking that question. It might be you might have experience, it might want to share, or maybe some research. Again, you might, for the time being, might want to retweet what someone else has said. Also, one of the reasons that I found in the past using a hashtag is if you're quite new to this field, or actually you might want to make connections in your own academia or your research, or maybe in your career, this is a great way of connecting people and creating collaboration. So I really do encourage you to actually share your experiences for today. Again, this will be live at the sort of breaks and intermission, so please do have a look. If you don't have your phone or mobile, I do encourage you after the conference to keep that conversation going and just keep this going after the conference, because I'm sure there'll be lots of debates and questions after. For people who want free Wi-Fi, we do have Wi-Fi guests. If you go on your Androids and Apple devices, you can actually access our free Wi-Fi. Do allow a couple of minutes for it to access, because it can be a bit slow in starting up. If you just open your browser on your Android or your iPad or your Apple, again, it should come up with a login screen. You just register, log in, and then you've got the Wi-Fi for today. But if you have any questions or anything, we've got a couple of social media gurus. I know Lewis and our partners and other people who are at the university here are happy to help you and direct you. But again, we've got another one here, brilliant. So again, I just really want to encourage you today, and I wish you all the best today, and have a great day. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the conference, which I guess is now really officially starting. I have to say, I've just learned in the last 3 minutes, probably 500% more than I ever knew about Twitter. I'm one of these people who's a little bit of a joke, and I never actually realised what a hashtag was actually for. So I think everybody can be tweeted away merrily. My name is Anne Farady. I'm from the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this opening panel. People will know BPAS because of the work that we do on abortion services in terms of both providing them and advocating them. But I can honestly say from the bottom of my heart that the values of our organisation are entirely about providing women with the choice around their pregnancy, their ability to make decisions, and if it were possible, we would be running not-for-profit assisted conception services in exactly the way that we run not-for-profit abortion services. And so it's a delight to see these things brought together, and I think particularly on this opening panel where I'm very happy to be introducing Sally Sheldon, who's a professor of law from Kent University, who's going to be talking to us about the origins of the Abortion Act and some work that she's doing into that and how that is about framing acceptable pregnancy. And then we'll be moving on to Dr. Jennie Bristow, who you know because she's a player for the home team here at Christchurch, who's going to be talking about policing pregnancy more broadly. What we're going to do is to have both of these colleagues introduce for about 15 minutes, so hold your questions and then we'll throw it open to question and points and discussion from the floor. So, Sally.
Thank you so much to Jennie and the organisers for inviting me. It's a fantastic privilege to open this conference. As people have said, it's an amazing programme, but there's also an amazing collection of expertise in the room from people who aren't speaking, so I'm sure we're going to have some great discussions. So I was asked to draw on the research that I'm currently in the very happy position of being able to conduct with a team of historians. There's me and 3 historians, and we're thinking about the Abortion Act, and we've started that project from the observation that while our legislation is almost 50 years old, so the Abortion Act 1967, and its text really hasn't changed very much since that point. The provision of abortion services and discussions and debates about abortion have changed very significantly over the last 50 years. So we're interested in thinking about both change and continuity in that process. And I think that speaks very interestingly to the themes of this conference. So the question of policing pregnancy and who should be a mother also has a flip side of who should not be a mother. As a lawyer, I would translate that into legal policy questions about who should be permitted to end a pregnancy, who should be supported in ending a pregnancy, what responsibility is there on the state to help people, help women in ending pregnancies. And I think that's going to raise a lot of broad themes about issues about scrutiny and surveillance, about shame, about responsibility, that are going to be picked up in other contexts as we go through the programme. I suppose what I want to focus on in thinking about this question is the idea of good reasons for ending a pregnancy, bad reasons for ending a pregnancy, deserving and undeserving cases where women want to end a pregnancy, because that's been a very strong theme in the regulation of abortion. And I'm going to start off by showing you perhaps the paradigm example of the deserving case. The deserving case is the woman who should be allowed to end a pregnancy. And this comes from the parliamentary debates in the run-up to the 1967 Act. It's a letter that's been sent to one of the leading liberalising reformers, Lord Silkin, and a woman writes to him that she's married to a drunk, she's got 4 children, she's 40, she's pregnant, she's been been struggling for years, and she just can't bear to go through that again. And she's presented to Parliament as the paradigm case of a woman who should really be allowed relief. She's not rejecting motherhood in general, she's not rejecting pregnancy in general, she's just saying, in order to be a better mother, in order to make this work, I need to be allowed to end this pregnancy. The problems for the reformers in 1967, however, was how you allow relief to these deserving women while not opening the floodgates to abortion on request, or what, in the more fearful language of those who opposed reform, abortion on demand. And the model that they arrived on for doing this was one of strict medical control. And this is the same regulatory framework that we've still got in place today. So abortion remains a criminal offence in the United Kingdom. And the way that the Abortion Act operates in England, Wales and Scotland, doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, is to say that criminal offence, those criminal offences don't apply provided the abortion is performed under conditions of strict medical control. It's performed by a doctor, it's performed on licensed or registered premises, and it is certified as necessary by 2 doctors. So the doctors there are playing a crucial role as gatekeepers to services, as sorting out the deserving from undeserving, in deciding who should have access to abortion services. And I've given you the text of the relevant provision there. The doctors are given 4 grounds, so they have to say if they want to authorise termination, they have to say it's because it fits into one of these 4 grounds. Almost all abortions, 98% today, are certified on the first of these 4 grounds. A balancing of risk between the woman's mental and physical health, continuing the pregnancy or ending it, and this applies within the first 24 weeks of pregnancy. That's all you need to know about the law. So what I want to think about in the context of this project, and our focus on continuity and change, is how that's been applied and what that's meant in practice. And I'm going to do this, if I can do this in 15 minutes, and this is going to be challenging, I'm going to do this by juxtaposing 2 cases. 2 media sting operations, because anyone who knows anything about the regulation of abortion services in this country, and Anne will know this very well, is it is subject to regular media stings. So this is investigative journalists going into clinics, wearing concealed tape recorders, trying to access services, and then publishing what they find in newspapers in more or less sensational ways. And I want to juxtapose this early case, which in some ways was the mother of all stings. 1974, 2 News of the World journalists go into a range of pregnancy testing services, abortion service providers, wearing concealed microphones, trying to access services. They published the findings of their investigation over the front page of the News of the World, which at that point has a circulation of 5.5 million. It's the world's biggest selling Sunday newspaper. They published their investigations over the front pages for a period of 4 weeks, and then subsequently as a book. And their allegations range from the utterly outrageous, completely crazy, to the much more grounded and better corroborated. So, for example, they say that women are being falsely diagnosed as pregnancy routinely, so that the profit-hungry abortion industry can sell them abortion services that they don't need. They say that fetal remains are being sold to the cosmetics industry so that they can be used in the production of soap. These allegations eventually unravel over the following months and the following years. However, there is a foundation that's much better evidence in the allegations that they make, and that's what I want to focus on. So one of the central claims that they make, and this was central to the contestation about abortion in 1974, is that they say abortion service providers are making abortion available on demand, and that's not what the law is supposed to be doing. The law had this role for doctors to sort the deserving from the undeserving. They say we decided to play the role of a childless, utterly selfish, self-seeking, self-indulgent married couple who could have no possible reason in the world for qualifying for an abortion. If it was possible for us to buy an abortion with our shallow cover story, they said, we've proven beyond all doubt that abortion on demand exists in Britain, which is contrary to both the law and the claims of successive government. And as part of this investigation, then, they go into service providers and they record the conversation. So the one case that I very briefly want to tell you about is their interview with this guy on the, apologies, very bad photo here, and you can see that I'm not a techie genius either. In fact, my research team laughed at me because I'm still going in photocopying everything, taking photos of photocopy, which, now I explain it to you, doesn't sound like the best way to me either. But that's what this is. So the guy in the photo there is Mr. Philip Bloom. He's a consultant psychiatrist. He's working from Harley Street. He sees the couple, Sue Kentish and Michael Litchfield. He interviews Sue Kentish on her own so that he can check she's not being coerced. She's there for 30 to 40 minutes. He asks her over 90 questions. He charges a modest fee by the standards of Harley Street. And they produce actually a reasonably accurate account of that interview in the newspaper, and this is taken from the newspaper, and then a very full account of the interview in the book. So he asks Sue Kentish, undercover, were you a bedwetter as a child? Have you suffered from depression? How's your sex life? Are you a perfectionist at home? When he asked, you don't swoon over babies, Sue replied, no, I mean I like other people's babies. In the end he says, well, I don't see any purpose in having a child that you don't want. He signs the abortion certification form and he writes a referral letter to a second doctor who will also meet with Sue Kentish and who will ultimately sign the form and then go on to perform the abortion. The referral letter says there's symptoms of some early disturbance. She's got no maternal feelings, she's an emotionally immature person, she could react very neurotically to a pregnancy forced upon her. She manifests a reactive anxiety state, and I think under the circumstances a termination is advisable. He sues for defamation. This comes to court. I haven't got time to go into the detail of that, but it's interesting just noting how the two of them, how Mr. Bloom and the journalist in that case represent what's happened. He says it's a perfectly normal interview. However, it was one that was informed by his belief that you have to respect a woman's right to decide that she doesn't want to go on with a pregnancy. The journalists, however, say no one could contend that Sue's answers depicted anything but a normal and balanced adult. If she qualified for an abortion on that interview, then no woman is fit to bear a child. The doctors are supposed to establish, regardless of the wishes of the mother, whether or not it will be harmful for her to have a child. The distinction is not that subtle. So you can see what's at issue there and what's being disputed, what's being contested. Right, so very quickly now I'm going to ask you to fast forward to 2017. 2 months back, the Mail Online published this expose of Mary Stopes International. The techniques used here were very, very similar. This is journalists going into the clinic, ringing up, recording what happens, and then reporting that in the newspaper. And this is how they report it. They say, when a male reporter contacted Mary Stokes saying she wanted an abortion, she was told there was no need to meet the doctor who would give her the go-ahead because it was routine for doctors to fill out the necessary forms behind the scenes. Call centre worker told her, we've already done the legal side of things, it's done before you get to the clinic. This is despite the fact that when asked for the reason, the reporter said, I just don't want the baby, which on its own is not grounds under the Abortion Act. I've shown you the relevant grounds for it. By the time the reporter got to the clinic, the I just don't want a baby justification had been recorded in her medical notes as client is emotionally unable to continue with the pregnancy, which fits with the legal conditions of section 1A. Now just think about what's the same and what's different about those two cases. Both of the cases are focused on clinical discretion, how that's operated under the Act, and the role of the doctor as gatekeeper to service this. And what you have then, the newspapers alleging that doctors just aren't fulfilling that role in the way that they're supposed to. They're constructing narratives just to fit the terms of the Abortion Act. They're not really sorting the deserving from the undeserving. Also though, think about how different that is now in terms of clinical practice. And remember, this is the same legal framework. So for Mr. Bloom, you've got a 30 to 40 minute interview, you've got over 90 questions. He twice asks her whether she's sure of her decision. He once asks whether she's considered adoption or not. He charges a modest fee and so on. Mary Stokes, you have, for that particular part of the discussion, 22 seconds spent on working out the legal justification for abortion on the phone to a medically untrained member of the call centre staff. So the practice is very, very different. And the thing that's even more interesting for me, actually, than that, is the contextualisation of the issue. So why is it that we should care about the gatekeeper role of doctors? In the Babies for Burning News of the World expose, it's very clearly the case that the journalists think that doctors should be refusing some women access to services. They should be sorting the deserving from the undeserving. They shouldn't be giving access to abortion services for financially comfortable married couples who just don't want to have children. That's not what the law is supposed to be about. Whereas the fascinating thing for me about that Mail investigation is that they're not saying that. So if you look at the piece and you look at what the concern is that women may be rushed in their decision making. The concern is that doctors aren't playing a role in identifying vulnerable women, in giving women the space to raise doubts and so on. That's how the concern is represented in the newspaper. So there's a very significant shift there, I think, and a much broader acceptance of Mr. Bloom's view that if a woman doesn't want to continue with a pregnancy, she should have the right to terminate it. That's not to say, however, that we've lost this focus on deserving and undeserving cases, but it is to say that that looks very different today, I think, than it did in 1974. So I'm going to just finish on this, and this is a piece of research that's been done by my colleague Claire Parker, who is a fantastic, painstaking historian who spent a lot of time pulling together every attempt to reform the Abortion Act since it was passed in 1967. And we think we've found all of them so far. There may be some more out there, but Claire so far has found almost 50 attempts to reform the legislation. And not only has she found these, she has colour-coded them by theme, and she would want me to say at this point that this is very broad brushstroke, and there's some complex pieces of legislation in there, and it's not very easy to limit them or to reduce them to this kind of colour coding. But I nonetheless think that this is fantastically useful in just telling you something about what's happening in this area. So I just want to pull out a couple of these things because I think it really says something useful about where the focus of attention is, where the concern is around the abortion legislation. I'm particularly thinking about these deserving and undeserving cases, which I hope will speak to some of the themes that are going to come up later in the workshop. So firstly, if you think just about service provision, you can see that was the focus of the early attempts at reform, and that at that point was very much about tightening up the medical decision making and restricting the kinds of doctors who were allowed to authorise abortions. So, for example, it was argued that one of those doctors should be an NHS consultant, and that would keep some tighter control of it. Very restrictive amendments you can see peaking in the 1980s and then declining, and these are amendments that actually tried to alter the grounds for abortion under the Act. So, for example, saying abortion should only be legally available to women where there's a serious or severe risk to their health. Time limits. You see, there's always been a focus on time limits in abortion. That peaks in the 1980s, trails off after the 1990s, and in the 1990s, in 1990, in fact, you have the one reform to the text of the Abortion Act, which builds in that 24-week limit into Section 1A. Ooh, oh no! Don't do that. What have I done now? My last slide was my face. And this slide, is that going to take me back to the beginning though? That's just a little reminder of everything we've seen so far. Just in case you're forgetting. This slide, I think, is really interesting in terms of the deserving and undeserving cases. What you can see in this is from the 1990s onwards, a different kind of concern really emerging about abortion services. And this is in the context of a broader acceptance of women having a right to choose, and anxiety about the basis on which women are sometimes making those decisions, specifically co-opting the language of the civil rights equality movement. So the idea that a woman would end a pregnancy because of the sex of the fetus or because the fetus has a disability causing particular anxiety. And that, I think, raises some really interesting and some complicated issues. What we think of as good and bad cases, what we think of as deserving and undeserving cases, and when I say we, I mean we as a society, so where the anxiety is around abortion legislation, which I think is going to raise some very interesting questions about shame, about responsibility, about which decisions it is that worry society. And I'm going to stop on that.
Thanks, Sally. Absolutely really well stuck to time. You can see she's very practiced academic with good experience in this. One question that I just kind of like you to think a little bit about, I mean, obviously you'll be listening to Jennie and giving her your full attention. But one thing that struck me while Sally was just talking was that way that back in the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a real sort of sense that a woman needed to be exceptional to end a pregnancy because normal women were imbued with all of the maternal, responsible impulses to enable them to have a baby and raise it properly. And I think that what Jennie is going to now take us on to is perhaps a little bit of a different discussion about the way that things appear today. I think it's really worth thinking a bit about what's changed. So maybe Jennie's going to tell us all about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Yes, I'm going to move seamlessly from Sally's talk by discussing very briefly what I call a 21st century contradiction. And this is, in a nutshell, that women today have unprecedented levels of sexual equality in terms of formal indicators in education, in politics, in work. I mean, there's obviously big debates that go on all the time about is it entirely equal or not. But there's a kind of real acceptance of a reality that women are more equal in these fields than they have been for many, many, many decades. And this is, in part, in quite large part, a consequence of developments in women's control over their fertility and their reproductive autonomy. So it's no accident that following the 1967 Abortion Act, we then had a rise in women's equality in the workplace, in politics, at the level of education. I don't think that was caused by the 67 Act. I think it all speaks to a sense that society thought this was important and facilitated women to have control over their fertility, which was then matched by how things developed in society. And yet, even though we have had what I think is a 50 years of tremendous advances in women's control over their fertility, women's control over their fertility remains limited and it remains controversial. It's a constant topic for discussion. I don't think that the question is settled. And we have a situation today where both ending and continuing a pregnancy is often framed as problematic. I want to illustrate this with a film. Get me social media. It's just a 3-minute film. This was produced by the We Trust Women campaign for the decriminalisation of abortion. I think it was produced last year. And this, I think, frames very nicely this tension between all the advances that we've had and the continuing regulation of women's fertility choices. I'm just going to go straight into the browser because whenever I try and embed a video, as my students will tell you, it all goes really horribly wrong.
Overcome. Which is why every woman watching this video is standing on the shoulders of giants. No matter who we are or what we do,
Let's just start the picture.
the fight for equality has been long. It has seen setbacks and victories, joy and sacrifice. But those victories and moments of joy have been long-lasting, the setbacks and sacrifice overcome. Which is why every woman watching this video is standing on the shoulders of giants. No matter who we are or what we do, we owe a debt of gratitude to the women who came before us and fought for our way of life. Our mothers, grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers. And they were great. They fought so that we could vote. They fought so that we could have equal pay for equal work. They fought to make rape in marriage illegal and property laws fair, and to create a world where we could thrive because of our ability, not be held back because of our biology. They taught us that there is no limit to what we can do except the limit we put upon ourselves. Many tried to hold them back. many still try to hold us back, even though it is against their own interests. Because it is no accident that the more equal a society becomes, the more developed it becomes. The more women who are allowed to advance on merit, the greater the depth of talent that business, science, politics, art, and every other part of society can draw from. When all are equal, we all benefit. So it may shock you to know that under a law passed in 1861, abortion is still illegal in the UK unless two doctors decide that the woman's physical or mental health is at risk. Does a more outdated, patriarchal law exist in Britain today than this? Why can't we trust a woman to make decisions about her own body? We have come so far. Changing this ancient law will be a symbol of just how far, a statement of intent that however far there is still to go, we will get there. One day, our own sons and daughters, when we choose to have them, will stand on our shoulders and see further than we have ever seen before. And they will know that when it counted, our generation stood up. Our generation continued the fight, men and women side by side. Our generation, when the time came, did something. That time is today. Help overturn this law. Join the campaign now.
So the purpose of that showing that video was to illustrate what I think really has underpinned the debate about women's reproductive choices for at least 2 centuries. And what we are seeing reflected today is a continuing tension between public and private spheres of life. So when abortion was made illegal under the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, it really reflected a society which was very keen to argue for separate spheres of life for men and women. And it was this notion that women existed properly in the domestic, private sphere of home, wifehood, motherhood that was used as the justification for why their control over their fertility should be limited. And this has been well discussed, well theorised in the academic literature, in historical work, really showing that that kind of separate sphere ideology of Victorian times very much contributed to the exclusion of women from public life. Now, we don't have that today. You know, women have been brought into public life big time, as I was saying at the beginning. And within the social domain, there is increased equality between men and women. However, there is still this tension between the public and private realms of life. And the way I think this can be most clearly explained is that whereas for Victorian societies, the problem was that the public and private domains were seen as very, very separate and could not be breached, today there's actually considered to be very little distinction between the public and private spheres of life. That what people do in their everyday lives, how people raise their children, how women conduct their pregnancies, which is centrally the discussion of this conference, is seen as kind of fair game, really, for policymakers, journalists, anybody. I mean, any woman here who's ever been pregnant recently will know that it's not unheard of to go into a bar as a pregnant woman and ask for a glass of wine and be told no, or are you sure? By somebody serving you a drink. There's just a general sense that your bump makes you public property. And this, I think, has very serious consequences for women's autonomy and beyond that, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So on the one hand, as an illustration of the extent to which people's private lives are now seen as fair game, we have the fact that every main government, so it began with the new Labour government, followed by the Cameron government, has put parenting policy as a centre, really, to its approach to social policy. And scholars of social policy will know that this is a very recent development, that up until the 1990s, Prime Ministers didn't really talk about how many hours a day people should spend with their children, or how many minutes a night they should read to them. Whereas now, Prime Ministers and major figures always seem to be talking about how to bring up your child. This is a speech that was given by David Cameron in January last year, called Life Chances, where he really kind of set out why it was very, very important that the government put parenting first, and why parenting was, you know, the most important thing that people can do. And, you know, importantly, the focus of that speech was on the very early years of life, or even months of life. As he said, if we're going to extend life chances in our country, it's time to begin talking properly about parenting and babies, and reinforcing what a huge choice having a child is in the first place. It was interesting, as well as what a big responsibility parents face in getting these early years right. So the message there is very clear, that if you are going to choose to not have a baby, if you're not going to get pregnant, or if you're going to have an abortion, well, that's all right. But if you're going to choose to continue that pregnancy, you better do it properly. And you have a huge responsibility for getting these early years right. I mean, what that obviously means is, if you do something wrong, then you are to blame. So a very, very uncompromising speech, which really reflected what sociologists have called the trend towards parental determinism in looking at how children turn out. This idea that whatever parents do has an immediate determining impact on what happens to their children. As well as parents being very, very important, parents are also framed as being very, very toxic. I like this quote from Jamie Oliver. I use it quite a lot because I think it kind of sums up that beneath every kind of policy discussion about how parenting is really important, parents are really important, you know, it's the most important thing you can do, there's a very clear kind of contempt, actually, for a lot of parents. So, yeah, this is Jamie. I mean, obviously Jamie's not a policy maker, but he likes to think he is one. He wants to combat childhood obesity, apparently. He also wants to get women to breastfeed, which led to quite a few sarcastic comments on websites like this one. So Jamie's saying, well, why don't women breastfeed? It's easy and convenient. It's like, really? And, you know, so there's this kind of sense that it's not just a policy approach we're talking about here, it's a wider cultural approach, where anyone who can be considered an expert thinks it's absolutely fine to tell pregnant women what to do. Well, tell parents what to do, I was going to say. Pregnant women are very much in the frame for this because they're an easy target, I think. I mean, this sign is, I think this is the one that you now get on bottles of wine, and you get it all over Europe as well. It's not just here. And I think it's a really interesting image. You know, keep out. You know, when pregnant women, keep out of this bottle of wine. And then you've got a silhouette of the pregnant woman. But at least she's got a head, which pregnant women don't normally have in photographs. Foods to avoid in pregnancy. This is what happens when you do a random Google image search. So this poor woman is thinking of all the things that she can't have, and what she actually can't have is food. And this, I love this image, right? So here you've got the headless bum of a woman who is wearing her underwear or going jogging or something while stroking the fag and got the beer, on top of a very scary looking fish, or something. And then there's the sort of cocktail party over in the corner, the runny eggs, a cup of coffee, something at the top. I don't actually, is that mud? I don't know. Some raw meat. And you know, you just got this sort of, this is the kind of imagery you see everywhere now. It's just sort of, you know, this is what it means to be pregnant. Do not do that, do not go there, do not behave like you used to behave. I think what's interesting here is that there's some very biologised and pro-life presumptions behind the policing of pregnancy behaviour. And these are sort of separate, but they also go together, and I think this is quite interesting. That if you look at a lot of the discussions currently taking place in the United States, you could say, and people often do say, oh well, you know, it's a pro-life agenda that's taking hold. The people are anti-abortion, they don't care about women, you know, and they see it in that kind of old-fashioned way of, well, you know, this is just not wanting women to have autonomy at all. But it's interesting in Britain, actually, because there isn't a pro-life presumption or an anti-abortion presumption behind abortion policy. I mean, as Sally's indicated, there's been a lot of attempts to restrict women's access to abortion, but there is generally a secular kind of political culture that sees it as very important that women should have access to abortion if they're considered to need one. I mean, partly because actually, if you're going to put all this pressure on women to parent in the right way, you want to make sure that women aren't just kind of going into it accidentally. So you've got that kind of general secular presumption, but you've also got quite a few sort of images that I think really speak to that sort of anti-abortion idea of women as vessels, really, for the unborn child. This is another random Google imaging. I thought this was really nice because this bump is not only headless and everything elseless, it's just a bump. In case you missed it with a label on it saying fragile, handle with care, which is this is the way that people are supposed to now think of their pregnancies. That, you know, what you've got is a very fragile thing. If you do one thing wrong, it's all going to go terribly wrong. This is something I think is interesting. I've talked to my colleagues quite a lot about policy being made up on the back of a fag packet. Health warnings now. You can, I mean, this is just one which I thought was very interesting because, yeah, smoking can kill your unborn child, which is the language that I always associate with anti-abortion campaigners, and now turning into a warning, a very kind of overstated warning about the impact of smoking. And this image, I got it off a breastfeeding blog. And I mean, okay, people might interpret it differently. What I see when I look at that is Rosie the Riveter, who instead of working in munitions and doing men's work, was holding a baby, and also looking like the Virgin Mary. And you know, you just get this sort of real sort of sense of the most important thing as a woman these days is to show that you put your bump first. Now, I just want to end just by making one point. I think that there's not a trade-off between, when we talk about choice, reproductive choice, I think that sorry, we get fire alarms all the time and they don't mean it. So there's often a kind of an idea that the choice to end a pregnancy should mean the responsibility to actively choose a pregnancy and therefore to become a willing participant in the incubator of a perfect pregnancy. And I want to say I don't think there should be that trade-off. I don't think it works like that. That what women's reproductive autonomy means is allowing women to engage fully in society as citizens. And citizenship involves engagement in public life and autonomy in private decision making. Women need the choice to end a pregnancy they don't want and also to make their own decisions about a pregnancy that they do want. And our aim in the conference is to really kind of pull out that extent to which pregnant women are positioned as sort of second-class citizens, really, in a discussion about how we act in society, how we should be treated, and to indicate that standing up for pregnant women actually does mean standing up for what it means to be a citizen and a full participant in modern society.